Welcome back, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. This is season 2 of Hurricane Hub Live. My name is Chief Meteorologist Tim Pandajis, and I will be guiding you through the 2026 hurricane season. And we're not just going to be focused on the Atlantic Basin, which right now is Snoozeville, but out in the Eastern Pacific, we've already got some action going on there. So we're going to walk through both of those basins. You can find Hurricane Hub Live every weekday evening at 8 p.m. Central, right here on the 13 News Now app and on all apps across our fellow Tegna stations across the country and all the hurricane markets. So let's get right to it. Today, Monday, June the 8th, we're 8 days into the hurricane season that started on June the 1st, goes all the way through November the 30th. It has been a quick 6 months since we last joined you for our inaugural season of Hurricane Hub Live. And that was, we start things off today. We've got a quiet Atlantic, as I mentioned, but busier in the Eastern Pacific. Would you believe it, that they are already on their third named storm, which, by the way, the Eastern Pacific season starts about 2.5 weeks earlier than the Atlantic Basin, starts on May the 15th. So they get kind of a head start on things as conditions get a little more conducive for development, a little bit quicker in the Eastern Pacific than they do in the Atlantic. Now, in the Atlantic, well, it actually affects both basins, the Eastern Pacific and the Atlantic, but we've got something called the Central American Gyre that's starting to become a little more active, and it's not unusual. This time of the year, we typically do see that sitting over Central America, and it can help to spawn some tropical mischief in either the far western portion of the Atlantic Basin or the Eastern Pacific, depending on what has a little bit more lift in the atmosphere or overall dynamics favoring it. But we're going to get diving into that. And of course, in the Atlantic this time of the year, too, something that halts any tropical development is when we get these plumes of Saharan dust. And we've got a couple out there that are making their way across the Atlantic and will make it into the skies over the southern U.S. in the next couple of weeks or so. Before we get into this season, let's quickly revisit where we ended up in 2025. We ended up with 13 named storms, 5 hurricanes, 4 majors. Now, what's notable about last season is that, thankfully, the U.S. skirted away without any hurricane landfalls, which is pretty significant because of the 4 major hurricanes, 3 of them were Cat 5s. And if you remember, Jamaica did not really miss out on that. Melissa slammed into them late in the season and then into Cuba as well, and that thankfully avoided the U.S. But it was an active season. Overall, it was in line with average. 14 named storms is average, so I guess you could say it was slightly below it. But notice all the tracks here. It started with Andrea, that developed as a subtropical storm pretty much out in the northern Atlantic. And then we had Barry, that did make landfall in Mexico. And Chantal was the only U.S. landfall, was a tropical storm, barely at that, as it made landfall near the South Carolina and North Carolina border along the coast there. And aside from that, Caribbean did have the deal with Melissa out there and little parts of Gabrielle, but that was about it, thankfully. Again, 3 Category 5s is very, very unusual. Now, typically at this point in the season, it is not all that active. June is very quiet, and you can see here, looking back on tropical activity in the Atlantic Basin, going back from 1944 to the very, very active season of 2020, even that didn't really increase the numbers here. We can find a few storms here and there in June, and you go back to 2020, we actually had some in May. But you really get into July, late July and early August, you start to see a little bit of a blip in activity increase, and then it levels off, and then we really start to ramp up. Middle of August, right on through the middle of September is typically when we start to really see the activity flare on up out there, as overall conditions just become a little more conducive. We get some of the warmer ocean temperatures, wind shear starts to pipe down, trade winds deteriorate a little bit, and overall it's a moist environment, very conducive to tropical development during that time. So here's a look at the list that we're using this year. Now, remember, they rotate every 6 years, so our 2026 list is the same list from 2020. However, with multiple names that were retired, we've got a few new names on there, but we did go through the first couple of names in 2020. Arthur was the first one. Now, even if you go back another iteration of these names, back to 2014, Arthur was our first named storm that did make landfall in the Outer Banks of North Carolina right during 4th of July weekend. How do I know? I was there. It moved right over Nags Head in the Outer Banks. I believe it peaked as a Category 2 hurricane at that point, cleared everybody out of the Outer Banks for 4th of July, the day before 4th of July, and then it was so fast moving that everything cleared out pretty quickly, and everybody came on back and enjoyed the rest of their weekend. So that was an interesting experience there. You got Bertha, Cristobal, Dolly, Edward, Faye, Gonzalo, and remember Isaias? That was also a storm that made landfall on the eastern seaboard in 2020, and that caused several tornadic outbreaks, and several people lost their lives in North Carolina as a result of tornadoes spawned from the landfall of Isaias. And it did impact us here in Hampton Roads in southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina. And you go on through the rest of the names on the list there, Teddy, Vicky, and Wilfred. We'll see if we get to that. Also, remember in 2020, we blew through the entire list and resulted over to the Greek alphabet. And that's the last time the Greek alphabet will ever be used. Now we have a subsequent list that will pull up. It's kind of, laying as a backup if we do ever blow through the whole name list, which hopefully we do not. Now, speaking of maybe if we go through the list or not, here's a look at the outlook for the 2026 season. Now, tomorrow I think we're going to go more in depth in some of the other outlooks because there are dozens of them on what various institutions and companies think the 2026 season will look like once all is said and done. But again, last year with 13, 5, and 4, Colorado State University, which puts out like the earliest outlook, this was released in early April, calling for 13, 6, and 2. So not all that far off from what we experienced last year. Now, on average, the 30-year average is 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 of those being major Category 3 or greater. So based on what Colorado State University says, we could be looking at a slightly below average hurricane season. Now, I will tell you when we dive into this further tomorrow, there are most of the outlooks that call for similar numbers like this, but there are a few that kind of say, I don't know about that. I think we might have an active or even above active season, above normal season. And we'll get into the reasoning and the thinking as to why. Also, NOAA put out their outlook. They're usually one of the last to put it out. They put it out about a week before the season gets underway, and they put a range. So you saw the average, 30-year average, 14, 7, and 3. Hurricane Center, NOAA, this year is calling for 8 to 14. So again, at or below average named storms. Hurricanes between 3 and 6, below average. Major hurricanes, Category 3 or greater, between 1 and 3. So at or below average there. So again, in line with what we just saw with Colorado State University. And a big reason why all of these institutions and companies are calling for below average activity is because models have been signaling now, especially more aggressively over the last 2 months, the European model in general here, which I'm showing you here, for not only a strong El Nino, but what you've probably seen and heard about is being a super El Nino. Now, basically, the threshold for that is going to be warm waters off of the Pacific coast of South America that are going to be in range of at least 2 degrees Celsius above normal or more. That's kind of the unspoken threshold for a super El Nino. In the current May outlook, there's just a June outlook that's even more aggressive than this one, calling for El Nino conditions or super El Nino conditions to be rampant by the peak of hurricane season. So by September and October, you can see it surpassing that threshold and possibly even getting up to 3 degrees Celsius above normal in the El Nino region. Now, when was the last time that we saw super El Ninos? Although I honestly have never heard it called super El Nino before this year, because it's happened before, not even all that long ago either. So we go back to 2023, 2024, we had El Nino reading of around 2 degrees Celsius, right? And then you got 2015, 2016, that one was almost off the charts. That was a big one. Now, I will say 2015 into 2016, when El Nino was present, 2016 season pretty much was the start of a hyperactive cycle of tropical activity in the Atlantic Basin. It started with Matthew, Hurricane Matthew, which in my memory was the first of this streak that started to rapidly intensify in such a manner that it was almost unprecedented at that time. It ramped up, I believe it was from a tropical storm up to a Cat 5. I have to check on this, but it was like in a very short amount of time, 24 hours, maybe 36 at most, but it just blew up, Hurricane Matthew. And that one also came up to visit us here in North Carolina and Virginia in 2016, coming off a super El Nino, okay? Now, 1997, 98 was another one that you can recall, a 2.5 degrees Celsius reading there. Not sure what the hurricane season looked like then, but overall, El Ninos typically support below active readings in terms of storm count. It doesn't mean it's going to be a dead season. It just means the storm count may be lower. And the big reason why is because El Niños ramp up the Eastern Pacific region while increasing the wind shear in the Atlantic basin. So wind shear is a change in wind speed and direction with height. Why that's detrimental to tropical systems is because tropical systems, hurricanes, are vertical engines. They build from the surface up vertically. And when you've got winds that are stronger aloft, it tilts those systems and they can't ventilate properly, and they eventually just get sheared apart or torn apart from the increased wind shear. El Niños are known for increasing the wind shear in the Atlantic basin, but not always. There are factors which are going to play into why other outlooks are for still above normal activity. It's because sometimes other factors can negate what the El Nino wind shear possibility would do. So it's going to be a very interesting thing to watch this season, folks. I don't think anything's set in stone with below average seasons or whatever. So let's talk a little bit more about El Nino Southern Oscillation. ENSO, El Nino, La Nina, or neutral conditions. What drives a neutral condition, or even La Nina, is going to be an increase in the trade winds that are coming in, pretty much blowing from the east to the west. And what this does, think of it as blowing on a hot cup of coffee, blowing the steam off it. That wind that you're blowing is going to be the trade winds, displacing the heat and pushing the heat farther off to the west. Upwelling cooler air, so drawing for La Nina conditions off the Pacific coast of South America. Now, this would tend to limit Eastern Pacific activity because the ocean temperatures are much cooler. You need warm ocean waters to support tropical development. This limits that. So that shuts down the Eastern Pacific. For the most part, not all the time. There's still activity out there, but that often opens up the window for more activity in the Atlantic basin. We do not have an La Nina this year. Now, what drives an El Nino? Kind of the opposite setup. The trade winds become much weaker. The heat is not getting dispersed. It's expanding and pushing off towards the east. And that means now we're getting a warm pool of water in the El Nino regions here that stretch along the equator and just off the coast of South America. That creates more rising motion, more wind shear in the Atlantic basin, and also the warmer ocean waters to facilitate a more active Eastern Pacific season, which we are already seeing with 3 named storms out there in the basin. So El Nino, Super El Nino could be helping things out here to keep things quiet in the Atlantic. But again, we'll see how things play out. So again, you're seeing the Atlantic tropical activity here starting to ramp up later in the season. Nothing out there right now, and a big reason why is because we get these plumes of Saharan dust this time of year. Also, overall conditions just aren't all that conducive yet. We don't have the warmest ocean waters yet. We don't have the deep, warm water yet. That's going to take a couple more months to really get in play. But the Saharan dust already present out there, that's dry air in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. And not only does it create a hostile environment for tropical activity, but it also kind of limits the warming of the ocean because those particles are obscuring the sunlight from reaching the surface of the ocean. The more dust that's out there, the cooler the ocean waters become. So that's happening out there right now in the Central Atlantic, and also this area here is what we call the main development region. So that's keeping those areas, even though water's still warm, it's just not warming up as quickly as long as there's dust present there. As I play this out, some model here showing plumes of that dust moving across the Atlantic basin, and eventually they do make it over the southeastern United States. When I was living in southeast Texas, we saw plenty of instances that we had the hazy days because of the Saharan dust coming on through off the Gulf. Now, how does it originate, the Saharan dust? How does the dust from the Saharan desert come all the way across the Atlantic and make it over to the U.S.? Well, you've got an area south of Sahara called the Sahel. And this is a moisture-rich area, rainforest, where tropical systems or waves kind of get going. And they fire off a lot of thunderstorm activity, clusters of thunderstorms. And as those collapse, those monsoonal storms, they have outflow that kicks up the dust in the Saharan desert to the north. They're so strong that it kicks up that dust and throws it aloft. That dust then gets higher up in the atmosphere, gets picked up by the trade winds, and then moves on that very long journey off to the west, across the Atlantic basin, over into the Caribbean, into the Gulf, off the southeast coast of the United States over the next couple of months. And this is really prevalent right up through mid-July or so. And then we start to see the dust plumes start to migrate farther to the north, opening up the main development region that starts to turn more active late July into early August. So right now in the Atlantic Basin, things are nice and quiet, again, due to the dust. We're monitoring the El Nino conditions, but we still have to talk about the Pacific. That's got 2 active storms out there right now. We're going to talk about that right after a quick break. All right, welcome back. We just finished up what's going on in the Atlantic, and it's a whole lot of nothing. No tropical formation expected there over the next 7 days, which is great. Not unusual, though. It is June. We're 8 days into the season. However, in the Eastern Pacific, look at this, 2 named storms. In fact, these are the 2nd and 3rd named storms of the season. We've got Boris right here, and we've got Christina well off to the south and east. Both are rather weak tropical storms. However, their location right along the coast of Mexico and Central America means they are bringing big-time impacts. Lots and lots of rain here, not so much in the way of wind, but a lot of tropical moisture, and there will be some significant impacts in regards to flooding and mudslides as both of these storms work their way gradually inland over the next 24 hours. They won't be long-lived, but they will certainly be impactful. Now, I want to bring your attention over to what we talked about in the last segment, was the Central American gyre. You can actually see it on satellite imagery here. You see this broad spin in the atmosphere? That is the Central American gyre. And what that basically is just a large area of tropical spin. And it is very prevalent at this point in the season, and it also reemerges later in the season, too. We get a gyre going as well. And a lot of times this can help to kind of spawn tropical development in either the far western Caribbean, southern Gulf, Bay of Campeche, or even the Eastern Pacific here. Now, how I usually remember this, how I visualize this, is you remember those big above ground circular pools? Maybe you had one in your backyard, or your friends did, and you guys would get in there and swim around the outer edges really fast. And after a while, it would begin swirling on its own, and you would sit in the current, and there'd be these little eddies that spin off in there. That's how I visualize it. Those little eddies are what give birth to tropical systems here. They add the spin into a favorable environment. Sometimes it's in the Western Caribbean. Sometimes it's in the Southern Gulf. And most of the time, I'd say, it's in the Eastern Pacific. So that's what we're seeing playing out here. And that's what helped to spawn Christina, and maybe even some regards, Boris. So Boris right now, tropical storm, 45-mile-per-hour winds. Remember, tropical storm, 39 miles per hour or greater. So it's a low-grade tropical storm, expected to kind of maintain this intensity here and then move over land, very mountainous region here in southwestern Mexico, and rain itself out and degrade quite rapidly by middle of the week, before the sun comes up on Wednesday. And then Christina, pretty much same intensity, but expected to get a little bit stronger by Wednesday, up to a 60-mile-per-hour tropical storm, just meandering offshore here. And then just like what we're going to see with Boris, it builds inland, rains itself out, and falls apart. But two big rainmakers in a generally small area here is going to cause a good amount of havoc. I want to focus here on Christina, and I want to show you something here called the spaghetti plots for Christina. Each line here is going to be a different computer model, and it's tracked for the center of Christina. What do you notice here? All right, it builds inland, but some of the models take it inland off to the west and east and northeast a little bit more, over the thinner part of southern Mexico, and possibly, in fact, several models here do take it over the southern Gulf, the Bay of Campeche here. So we're going from the eastern Pacific to the Atlantic Basin. That's pretty unusual, right? These are called cross-basin storms. And they happen, but what happens if Christina crosses over into the Atlantic? What happens with the name? Do we get a Christina, so we just jump ahead of the A and B in Atlantic? Or do we get our first name storm, Arthur? We go from Christina to Arthur. Well, there's some criteria for that. So if the storm Christina, if the surface circulation survives the land crossing, which is really hard to do, it keeps the same name. So we would have tropical storm or tropical depression Christina in the Atlantic. Now it gets a new name, which would be Arthur, if the surface circulation dissipates, crossing over land, and then redevelops in the southern Gulf Bay of Campeche. Now, going back to 2022, Bonnie did this. It was in the Atlantic Basin to start. It was Tropical Storm Bonnie. Then it crossed in the eastern Pacific, strengthened, and became Hurricane Bonnie. So it kept the same name as its surface circulation survived the land crossing. Couldn't really find that many examples. In fact, I couldn't find any in the last couple decades that went from the East Pac to the Atlantic. If you know of any, let me know on social media for sure. I'd love to know that. But Bonnie was the last one in 2022. There was also Julia, but that one kind of fell apart and didn't redevelop. All right, here's a look at our Pacific names for this year. So we've already crossed off Amanda, Boris, and now we're on Christina. Next up, which right now there's no active areas that they're monitoring for the development of Douglas, but that would be next up as the fourth named storm here. And the way things are going, I wouldn't doubt if we get the fourth or even fifth named storm before the month of June is out in the eastern Pacific. All right, hurricane season is underway, obviously, but how do these powerful storms actually form? From warm waters to swirling winds, we'll show you the science behind nature's most dangerous weather systems. That's coming up next. With us being well into the hurricane season, meteorologist Hunter Forrest tells us just how major storms form.
Hurricanes are the most violent storms on Earth. They form as waves coming off the coast of Africa. Like all tropical cyclones, a hurricane needs the warm waters of the tropics, which feeds the storm the energy in order to form. The warm water then helps fuel the system, providing energy that causes the warm air in the center to rise faster. It condenses high in the atmosphere, creating thunderstorms. If conditions are favorable, a tropical depression develops into a tropical storm, and then finally, a hurricane. As rising air in the storm's center condenses, it produces heat, forcing it to rise even faster, pushing air out the top, and more air has to rush in at the surface to take its place. The pattern allows the storm to essentially feed itself and grow in strength. Because of the Earth's rotation, all hurricanes in the northern hemisphere rotate counterclockwise. The most destructive part of the storm is normally in the eye wall area to the northeast of the eye. This is the area that causes the most destruction when a hurricane makes landfall, leading to higher winds and storm surge.
All right, take a look at your screen. For more information as hurricane season continues, visit the 13 News Now Hurricane Fast Facts playlist on YouTube. You can get to it by scanning the QR code on the screen right there. There you can find information on supplies you should have on hand, emergency resources, storm facts, and a whole lot more. And of course, you get live linked over to our Hurricane Hub Live every weekday evening at 8 p.m. We'll be right back. All right, folks, we're about out of time here on our first installment on our second season of Hurricane Hub Live. Remember, we're here every night, every weekday night at 8 p.m. Eastern for Hurricane Hub Live. We'll see you back here tomorrow night.